Ronald Joseph Dominique was born on January 9th, 1964, in Thibodaux, Louisiana. He was the youngest of 6 children in a poor family. His parents worked as laborers and struggled to make ends meet, living in a trailer park on the outskirts of Thibodaux. Growing up, Dominique's life was marked by hardship and a sense of isolation. He often found himself separated from others, particularly due to his melancholic temperament and lack of communication skills. His classmates noticed his weight problems, which became a target for bullying. Unlike many of his peers, Dominique did not partake in the social activities that many teens did. He didn't drink, do drugs, or engage in sports, which only further distanced him from his classmates. Despite singing in the school choir, Dominique's inability to fit in led to his status as an unpopular social outcast. While his classmates were socializing and experimenting, he remained on the fringes, struggling with low self-esteem. As Dominique approached the end of his high school years, he discovered that he was gay, a realization that would further complicate his already difficult social life. He began to visit a local gay bar in secret, but when some of his classmates noticed him there, he faced harassment. The pressure from his peers led him to vehemently deny any accusations of homosexuality. He kept his sexual identity hidden, and the fear of rejection only deepened his isolation. Dominique graduated from Thibodaux High School in 1983, but life after high school did not improve. His family's financial struggles meant that Dominique had to face life with limited opportunities. He enrolled at Nicholls State University, where he pursued a degree in computer science. However, he quickly lost interest in his studies and dropped out by the mid-1980s. Without a degree or stable career prospects, Dominique found himself working low-skilled labor jobs for the next few years. He was often in and out of employment, struggling to hold on to any job due to his disciplinary issues. Despite these challenges, Dominique was able to rely on his family for support. He lived with his mother and older sister at various points during this time, relying on their incomes to survive. However, his lack of independence and inability to maintain a steady job took a toll on his mental health. His life lacked direction, and he struggled with feelings of inadequacy. His early legal troubles began in June 1985 when he was arrested for making harassing phone calls to an unidentified person. He was fined $75 for this offense, a small indication of the personal turmoil that would follow. However, this incident was just the beginning of a pattern that would define Dominique's adult life. In May of 1994, he was arrested for drunk driving, an offense that would only add to his growing list of legal troubles. In August of 1996, Dominique was arrested after a young man jumped out of his sister's window, claiming that Dominique had assaulted and attempted to kill him. Despite the allegations, Dominique's case was dismissed when the victim could not be located or identified. Though this incident raised suspicions, it was not enough to secure a conviction, and Dominique was once again allowed to slip through the cracks. Dominique's early adult years were marked by instability and criminal behavior, but it was only the beginning of a much darker chapter in his life. His relationship with his sexuality, his inability to connect with others, and his repeated brushes with the law all pointed to a man struggling with his identity. These issues, however, would not remain in the past. Over the next decade, they would gradually lead Dominique down a more sinister path, one that would bring him into the spotlight for crimes that would shake Louisiana to its core. But before he could become known as the Bayou Strangler, Ronald Dominique would go on to commit a series of heinous acts that would remain hidden for years. In the early stages of his criminal career, his actions would go unnoticed. But the pattern of violence he started to form would eventually lead investigators to a terrifying conclusion. As the years passed, Ronald Dominique's life remained a whirlwind of instability and frustration. His criminal behavior escalated in the late 1990s, and with each passing year, the darkness in his mind began to manifest in terrifying ways. While many people in Thibodaux and the surrounding areas viewed him as a harmless recluse, there was something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. The early 90s marked the beginning of Dominique's violent and murderous actions. In the late evening of November 18, 1997, the first victim of Ronald Dominique was found. A 23-year-old man named Dwayne Boudreau was discovered lying face down in a ditch in a rural area outside of Thibodaux. His body showed signs of sexual assault and strangulation, and investigators initially had no idea who could have committed such a brutal crime. Dominique, known for his quiet demeanor and tendency to keep to himself, was not a suspect at first. Law enforcement had no leads to follow, and the case grew cold as the months dragged on. However, Dominique's pattern had already begun. What had been a single, isolated crime would soon become part of a chilling series of murders that stretched over a period of more than a decade. By March of 1998, another body was discovered, this time in a remote area near the small town of Houma. The victim, identified as 35-year-old Albert Weathers, had been strangled in a similar manner to Boudreau. The similarities in the cases raised alarms, but at this point, there was still no direct link between the two victims. Authorities initially believed the deaths might be related to drug activity in the area, but as the bodies piled up, it became clear that a more methodical killer was at work. By this time, Dominique's pattern of targeting men, particularly those who were either living on the fringes of society or involved in drug use, became evident. He specifically preyed on those who were vulnerable, often luring them to secluded areas under the pretense of offering assistance, companionship, or an escape from their troubles. Once alone with his victims, Dominique would overpower them, strangle them to death, and then leave their bodies in remote, desolate locations. His next victim, 30-year-old Kendrick Mouton, was found on May 27, 1998. Mouton's body was discovered in a secluded wooded area near Shivers, Louisiana, only a few miles from the previous crime scenes. Like the others, Mouton had been strangled, and the method of killing suggested the work of a single perpetrator. By this time, Dominique's dark urges were growing stronger, and he knew that his violent outbursts could not be contained for much longer. Dominique was careful not to leave behind evidence that would directly implicate him in the crimes. He knew the area well, and he had a quiet, unobtrusive way of moving about unnoticed. His interactions with his victims were often brief, and he used his unassuming appearance to his advantage. He would often visit gay bars and social gatherings to find potential victims who were less likely to be reported missing quickly. The brutality of his killings became more pronounced over time. His method of strangling was consistent. He would use a piece of clothing, often a shoelace or a belt, to choke the victims. But what set Dominique apart from other serial killers was the lack of any obvious motive or clear relationship to the victims. Each time he killed, Dominique was meticulous, leaving little trace behind, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for authorities to connect the dots. As the bodies of his victims accumulated, so did the fear in the small towns of Louisiana. The media began to report on the unsolved deaths, but with each passing case, the mystery of the killer only deepened. Law enforcement in the area started to suspect that the murders were the work of a serial killer, but they had no way of knowing how many more victims Dominique had claimed in the years before the first confirmed murder. While the police struggled to piece together the clues, Dominique continued his deadly rampage. His crimes were becoming more bold, more desperate, and it was clear that he was not done. By the time investigators had made the connection between the victims, Dominique had already killed several more. Yet for years, his identity remained a mystery. It was not until the early 2000s, when a breakthrough in DNA technology became available, that law enforcement began to close in on the Bayou Strangler. This technological advancement allowed investigators to link the murders together in ways that had never been possible before. Dominique's long history of targeting vulnerable men would soon catch up with him as the investigation into the Bayou Strangler intensified. Despite the mounting evidence, Ronald Dominique's reign of terror did not end quickly. His ability to elude capture for so long left many questioning how such a methodical killer could remain unnoticed for so many years. His crimes were chilling, and yet he managed to blend into the background of his small community, unnoticed by friends, family, and authorities alike. But as the investigation continued to grow in scope, one question remained unanswered. How many victims had Dominique killed before law enforcement was finally able to track him down? By the early 2000s, as the number of victims grew, authorities began to realize that the case of the Bayou Strangler was far more complex than originally anticipated. Despite the growing fear in the community, there were still no concrete leads. The killer had maintained a chilling pattern, but law enforcement was struggling to put the pieces together. The first break in the case came in the form of advances in forensic science, specifically DNA analysis. With the help of these technological improvements, investigators were able to connect several murders that had previously seemed unrelated. In the summer of 2001, detectives began revisiting old crime scenes, collecting DNA samples from the victims' bodies, and comparing them to the existing database of unsolved cases. It wasn't long before a match was found. The DNA from several of the bodies was linked to a single individual, Ronald Dominique. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team, as Dominique had managed to evade detection for over 4 years. Though the DNA evidence was now pointing toward him, Dominique had been careful to avoid leaving direct evidence at the crime scenes. His meticulous methods made it difficult for law enforcement to pinpoint his identity earlier. The lack of eyewitnesses and the remote locations where the victims were left further complicated the investigation. As authorities shifted their focus onto Dominique, they uncovered more about his background and the eerie pattern of his killings. At the time, Ronald Dominique was living a quiet, unassuming life in the small town of Thibodaux, Louisiana, where he had worked for years as a laborer. He was known in the community as a reclusive man who often kept to himself. This made it hard for anyone to connect him to the murders. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as a quiet guy who never caused any trouble, making it all the more shocking when his involvement in such heinous acts became clear. Dominique's criminal history had not raised any red flags, as he had no prior convictions for violent crime. Most of his past interactions with law enforcement had been related to minor offenses, such as public intoxication or theft, making it easy for authorities to overlook him as a suspect. However, as investigators dug deeper into his past, they began to see a disturbing pattern of behavior. One key piece of evidence that emerged was Dominique's history of visiting gay bars and social events. It was revealed that he often frequented places where he could meet men who were more vulnerable, particularly those struggling with addiction or homelessness. These men, who were often isolated and without support, became easy targets for Dominique. He would approach them, offering companionship or help in exchange for a ride or a place to stay. His victims rarely put up a fight, as Dominique carefully selected individuals who were less likely to resist or even report him. As the investigation into Dominique progressed, detectives discovered that many of his victims had been picked up in the same manner, which led them to believe that he had developed a specific method for selecting and luring his targets. His ability to remain unnoticed, even in the wake of multiple murders, baffled law enforcement. The town of Thibodaux had no idea that one of its own was responsible for such a series of horrific killings. In addition to the physical evidence, investigators began to rely on interviews with witnesses and the community. However, Dominique's low-profile lifestyle made it difficult to gather useful information. Neighbors reported that he rarely socialized and often stayed to himself, adding to his aura of mystery. He had no known close friends, and his interactions with others seemed casual and fleeting. The lack of any suspicious behavior from Dominique made it difficult for anyone to connect him to the murders at the time. Despite the lack of direct witness testimony, the DNA evidence became the key to solving the case. Once the authorities had a confirmed match linking Dominique to several murders, they began preparing for his arrest. By the time they moved forward with their investigation, Ronald Dominique had already been living in the same area for over a decade, and many of his neighbors were shocked to learn of his dark secret. On February the 20th, 2002, authorities finally arrested Ronald Dominique at his home. He was taken into custody without incident, and when confronted with the evidence, he confessed to the murders. His calm demeanor during the interrogation only added to the chilling nature of his crimes. Dominique revealed that he had murdered a total of 8 men over a span of several years. However, investigators believed that the true number of victims was higher, possibly in the double digits. Many of his other killings had gone unreported or were mistaken for accidents, given the remote locations where he left the bodies. Following his arrest, the investigation into Dominique's past continued to unfold. Authorities learned that he had lived in the area for years without attracting much attention, and he had managed to maintain a low profile throughout the entire period of his killing spree. This baffled both law enforcement and the local community, who had seen him as a quiet, unremarkable individual. As investigators began to interview those who had known Dominique, a clearer picture emerged. Many people described him as someone who struggled with personal issues and had difficulty forming meaningful relationships. He had been a social outcast for much of his life and seemed to harbor deep anger and resentment. These feelings may have fueled his violent acts as he sought to exert control over his victims in a way that he had never been able to do in his personal life. The investigation into Ronald Dominique's murders ultimately revealed a disturbing pattern of manipulation, violence, and careful planning. But for many, the most haunting aspect of the case was how easily Dominique had blended into the community, living alongside the people he would later terrorize. His ability to deceive everyone around him while committing such gruesome acts made him one of the most chilling serial killers in modern history. Once Ronald Dominique was arrested and charged with multiple murders, the next phase of the case shifted to the court system. His trial became a pivotal moment in the community as people struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet man they had known with the horrifying reality of his crimes. In the weeks following his arrest, the media coverage intensified, and the public became increasingly captivated by the details of the case. Dominique's trial began in early 2003. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented overwhelming DNA evidence that confirmed his role in the murders. Forensic experts testified about the connection between Dominique's DNA and the victims found in remote areas around the Bayou region. The prosecution argued that Dominique had carefully selected vulnerable individuals, luring them in with promises of companionship or help, only to take their lives in a brutal and calculated manner. Despite his confession, Dominique's defense team sought to argue that he should be held accountable for fewer murders than the prosecution claimed. His lawyers attempted to downplay the number of victims, suggesting that some of the deaths might have been accidental or unrelated to Dominique's actions. However, the evidence presented in court painted a different picture. It was clear that Dominique had intentionally targeted his victims over a period of several years, and his pattern of behavior suggested a clear and disturbing motive behind the murders. One of the most harrowing aspects of the trial was the testimony from the victims' families. Relatives of the men who had been murdered spoke of their heartbreak, frustration, and the deep void left by the loss of their loved ones. Many of the victims' families had lived for years without answers, hoping against hope that their relatives would return home. The realization that Dominique was responsible for these murders provided some closure, but also deepened the pain of losing someone in such a senseless and violent way. Throughout the trial, Dominique appeared disinterested and detached from the proceedings. His calm demeanor during interrogations and court hearings only added to the unsettling nature of the case. For many, his lack of visible remorse was one of the most chilling aspects of his personality. He offered little explanation for his actions, beyond vague statements about struggling with personal demons, but his motives remained largely unclear. In May of 2003, Dominique was convicted of multiple counts of murder. The jury deliberated for several hours before delivering a unanimous verdict. His conviction brought a sense of relief to the victims' families, but it did little to erase the lasting impact of his crimes. The community, which had once seen Dominique as an unremarkable figure, was left reeling from the realization that a serial killer had lived among them for so long. Dominique's sentencing took place shortly after his conviction, and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lack of remorse, combined with the horrific nature of his crimes, led to a swift and firm sentence. Many believed that this was the only appropriate punishment for a man who had stolen so many lives without any justification or explanation. The judge's decision reinforced the severity of Dominique's actions, ensuring that he would never be able to harm anyone again. Following his conviction, Dominique was transferred to the Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola Prison, one of the most notorious maximum security prisons in the country. There, he would serve out his life sentence, away from the public eye. The details of his life behind bars remain largely unknown, but the fact that he would never again be free brought a sense of justice to those who had suffered from his crimes. In the years following Dominique's arrest and conviction, the case continued to resonate with the local community. The Bayou Strangler's reign of terror had lasted for over a decade, and the realization that the killer had been so close to home left many feeling betrayed and fearful. His actions prompted a reevaluation of how law enforcement handled missing persons cases, and how communities responded to reports of vulnerable individuals disappearing without a trace. Though Dominique's capture brought an end to the string of murders, the emotional toll on the victims' families and the community could never be fully undone. Many of the families spent years wondering if they would ever find out what had happened to their loved ones, and the pain of their loss would never truly go away. Even though the case had been solved, the shadows of Dominique's crimes lingered in the minds of those affected. Dominique's case also had a lasting impact on the field of criminal justice. The use of DNA evidence in his conviction underscored the growing importance of forensic science in solving cold cases. His capture demonstrated how technological advancements in law enforcement could make a difference, even after years of seemingly no progress. It was a pivotal moment in the evolution of criminal investigations, as DNA analysis became an even more crucial tool in identifying suspects and securing convictions. In the end, the story of Ronald Dominique, the Bayou Strangler, serves as a chilling reminder of how even the most ordinary-seeming people can harbor dark secrets. Dominique's ability to live among his victims undetected for so long raises questions about how well we truly know those around us. His story also highlights the importance of vigilance, both from law enforcement and the community, in preventing such crimes from going unnoticed. Though the case is officially closed, the legacy of Ronald Dominique's crimes will never be forgotten by those who were affected by them. The families of his victims continue to honor their loved ones' memories, and the town of Thibodaux, Louisiana, will forever bear the scars left by the Bayou Strangler's reign of terror. In the late 1990s, the quiet neighborhoods surrounding Baton Rouge, Louisiana, began to feel less safe. Between the years 1998 and 2003, a string of violent and unexplained murders shook the region. Women were disappearing from their homes, and their bodies were turning up in remote places with no clear explanation. Many of these victims were educated, lived in safe communities, and had no known enemies, but someone was watching them. The first known victim was Randy Mabrewer, a woman from Zachary, Louisiana. On the night of April 27th, 1998, Randy was attacked inside her home. When police arrived, they found signs of a struggle, but she was gone. Her body was not found for years. The case remained unsolved, with no leads and no suspects. What no one realized at the time was that this was just the beginning. Then came the murder of Gina Green, a schoolteacher from Baton Rouge, who was found dead in her home in September of 1999. She was only 26 years old. Like Randy, she lived alone and had no known enemies. The lack of forced entry raised red flags, but investigators could not connect her death to any others at the time. There was still no sense of a serial killer at work. As months passed, more women were attacked and killed under similar conditions. Each time, investigators were left without any obvious motive or suspect. Cell phones and personal items were missing. In several cases, there were no signs of forced entry, which confused detectives. People began locking their doors earlier. Women refused to go out at night alone. Baton Rouge was no longer the safe place it once felt like. During this time, a profile of the killer was created by the FBI. Based on limited information, the profile wrongly suggested that the killer was a white man. This mistake caused investigators to spend years looking in the wrong direction, testing the DNA of thousands of white men and missing key clues. The real killer continued to stalk and kill unnoticed. As fear spread across the city, local news reports started to connect the dots. Women were dying in different parts of the Baton Rouge area, Addis, Zachary, Lafayette, and the killings had enough in common to raise serious concerns. Still, the idea of a serial killer living among them seemed unthinkable. It would take another major crime and a survivor to finally point investigators in the right direction. But in those early years, the community lived in fear, waiting and wondering who would be next. The man behind these killings, Derrick Todd Lee, was still living freely, blending into the crowd. Most people had never heard his name, not yet. As the murders continued, the people of Baton Rouge were gripped by fear. From the late 1990s into the early 2000s, women were being killed in and around the area with no clear suspect in sight. Each time another victim was found, the fear spread further. Families changed their routines. Many women no longer felt safe in their homes. The killer was targeting victims in a way that left no clear pattern, making it even harder for people to protect themselves. The city, normally known for its southern charm, felt cold and uncertain. The police faced serious challenges. Early on, they believed the killer was white. This assumption came from eyewitness reports and a psychological profile built with help from the FBI. Relying on this, law enforcement began testing the DNA of thousands of white men living in the Baton Rouge area, hoping to find a match. But all of those DNA tests led nowhere. Weeks turned into months, and then years passed with no arrests, no charges, and no clear direction. For a long time, it felt like the case was frozen in place. It was not until a private company was brought in that things began to shift. DNA print genomics was allowed to run ancestry testing on DNA left behind at the crime scenes. The results were unexpected. The analysis showed that the suspect was at least 85% African. This major development changed everything. With one test, the profile of the killer completely shifted, and investigators had to rethink the direction of their case. Police then began to re-examine earlier crimes that had gone unsolved. They looked closely at a murder that had taken place in the town of Addis in January of the year 2002. The victim, a young woman named Geraldine DeSoto, had fought back against her attacker. Skin cells had been found under her fingernails. Those cells provided a DNA sample that would eventually become one of the strongest links in the case. In May of the year 2003, a woman named Diane Alexander survived a brutal attack in her home in St. Martin Parish. She had been beaten, and the man had tried to take her life. But the attack was interrupted when her teenage son came home and walked into the house. The man fled out the back door. Diane survived, and her detailed description of the attacker allowed a sketch artist to create a clear image of the man who had nearly killed her. Not long after the sketch was released to the public, police in the town of Zachary recognized the man. They had investigated him in a separate incident months earlier. His name was Derrick Todd Lee. As it turned out, The police in Zachary had already taken a DNA sample from Lee during an earlier investigation. That sample had been sitting in evidence, waiting to be tested. Once it was sent to the lab, and compared to the samples from the crime scenes, the result was a match. With this breakthrough, police finally had the evidence they needed to name a suspect. The man they were looking for had been right there the entire time. He had a criminal past that included stalking and peeping into women's windows, but he had slipped through the cracks. Now, with a DNA match in hand, the investigation took a major step forward, but there was still more work to do. Lee was not in Louisiana. Investigators had to find him. The manhunt was on. Once authorities had confirmed Derrick Todd Lee's DNA matched samples from multiple murder scenes, the search for him became a top priority. By the end of May, in the year 2003, law enforcement agencies across Louisiana and neighboring states were placed on high alert. The Baton Rouge Police Department, along with state and federal agents, worked around the clock to track his movements. They believed he had fled the area shortly after the release of the composite sketch. Lee had traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, where he had family. Investigators traced him to a home in the suburb of Atlanta called Stone Mountain. On May 27th of that year, police, working with the FBI and local authorities, surrounded the home. Lee was arrested without incident. At the time of his capture, he appeared calm and offered no resistance. He was quickly extradited back to Louisiana to face charges. At the center of the case against Lee was the DNA evidence. The samples taken from the crime scenes were matched to Lee using advanced forensic technology, leaving no doubt about his connection to the murders. But investigators wanted more than just DNA. They needed to understand how he had gone unnoticed for so long and whether he had committed additional crimes. As detectives dug deeper into Lee's background, they uncovered a long history of violence and disturbing behavior. He had been arrested numerous times as a young adult, mostly for minor crimes. But police reports also showed a pattern of stalking, peeping, and breaking into women's homes. In many of these cases, he was never convicted. Either the victims chose not to press charges, or there was not enough evidence to move forward. These missed opportunities would later become a major point of criticism directed at the justice system. Psychologists who studied Lee's case pointed out that he had been skilled at presenting himself as quiet and unthreatening. He often came across as polite and soft-spoken. This allowed him to slip under the radar. Neighbors described him as a quiet man who mostly kept to himself, and few suspected he was capable of such horrific crimes. Following his arrest, Lee was charged with the murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, whose body had been found in May of the year 2002. She had been beaten and stabbed multiple times inside her home in Baton Rouge. The crime scene had been especially violent. DNA recovered from the scene was a direct match to Lee. Although this was the first official charge, police strongly suspected Lee was responsible for at least 6 other murders in the area. These included the killings of Trinisha Dean Colomb, Pamela Keenamore, and Carrie Yoder, among others. Each case had its own evidence, and investigators began to build separate files to connect him to all of them. The trial process would be long and complex. Prosecutors worked to organize the cases by strength of evidence. They chose to begin with the strongest DNA-linked case to ensure a conviction. As the legal system prepared for trial, more details about Derrick Todd Lee's past continued to come to light, details that shocked the public and raised serious questions about how many chances had been missed to stop him earlier. But the court process was just beginning. Families of the victims wanted justice, and the people of Louisiana waited to see whether the system would finally deliver it. Derrick Todd Lee's first trial began in August of the year 2004, more than 1 year after his arrest. Prosecutors focused on the murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, the case with the most direct DNA evidence. The trial took place in West Baton Rouge Parish. After a change of venue was granted, due to the extensive media coverage in East Baton Rouge. The courtroom was filled with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of the victims, all waiting for justice to be served. The prosecution presented a clear and detailed case, supported by forensic evidence, including the DNA match found at the crime scene. Testimony from forensic experts helped the jury understand the certainty of the DNA analysis. Other witnesses included law enforcement officers who had worked the case, as well as people who had interacted with Lee around the time of the murder. Though he did not testify in his own defense, Lee's attorneys attempted to raise questions about the reliability of the timeline and sought to cast doubt on the handling of the crime scene evidence. Despite these efforts, the jury found Derrick Todd Lee guilty of first-degree murder on August 10th of the year 2004. The verdict was unanimous. Just days later, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The sentence was handed down after emotional testimony from the victim's family during the penalty phase of the trial. It marked a major moment in the case, but it was not the end of the legal proceedings. Over the next several years, Lee faced additional charges for other murders, including those of Geraldine DeSoto and Carrie Yoder. In October of the year 2004, he was convicted of second-degree murder in the DeSoto case and received a life sentence, without the possibility of parole. In each new case, prosecutors used DNA evidence and other forensic tools to strengthen their arguments. The pattern of violence and the similarities between the victims played a key role in showing that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader series of crimes committed by the same man. Lee remained on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, often called Angola Prison. Over time, his name faded somewhat from the headlines, but the impact of his crimes was long-lasting. The families of the victims continued to grieve, and many became advocates for improved DNA testing and better protection for women. In January of the year 2016, Derrick Todd Lee died at the age of 47 from heart disease. He had been hospitalized with an infection shortly before his death. His passing brought a sense of closure to some, but for others, it left lingering questions about how he had evaded justice for so long and how many more victims there might have been. Following the case, Louisiana law enforcement agencies made significant changes to their handling of serial crimes. The Baton Rouge Serial Killer case led to statewide reforms in how DNA evidence was collected, tested, and shared between departments. More emphasis was placed on cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and new databases were created to help link crimes more quickly. The case of Derrick Todd Lee also sparked a broader national conversation about the importance of forensic science and the need for consistent use of DNA in violent crime investigations. His crimes left a lasting legacy, not only because of the horror they caused, but also because of the changes they forced within the justice system. The lives lost to his violence will never be forgotten, and their families continue to remember them not just as victims, but as individuals whose stories must be told, and whose justice came, though far too late. In the spring of 1918, a wave of terror began in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was a time of uncertainty and fear, as an unknown killer stalked the city, breaking into homes in the dead of night and attacking innocent victims with a deadly axe. The crimes were brutal, and the city quickly realized that a serial murderer was on the loose. The first widely recognized attack occurred in May of that year. A grocer named Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were found in their home with severe injuries. Their throats had been cut with a straight razor, and their skulls had been bludgeoned with an axe. Although Joseph initially survived the attack, he passed away shortly after being discovered. Investigators were baffled by the crime scene. Nothing had been stolen, and the murder weapon belonged to the victims themselves. The killer had left behind bloody clothing, suggesting that he had taken the time to change before fleeing. Just weeks later, another attack shocked the city. On June 27th, a man named Louis Bessumer and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, were discovered in the living quarters behind Bessumer's grocery store. Both had been struck in the head with an axe. Lois suffered severe injuries, leaving one side of her face permanently paralyzed. The weapon was found abandoned in a nearby bathroom. Once again, the killer had gained entry by removing a panel from the back door, and no valuables had been taken. These crimes sent shockwaves through the community. People began locking their doors at night, something that was uncommon in New Orleans at the time. The police struggled to find answers, as the attack seemed completely random. There was no clear motive, no robbery, no personal disputes, no signs of forced entry, beyond the back door panels being removed. The lack of evidence made it nearly impossible to track down a suspect. The city was on edge and rumors began to spread. Some speculated that the killer was targeting Italian immigrants, as several of the victims were of Italian descent. Others believed the crimes were connected to organized crime, though no solid evidence supported this theory. The press sensationalized the attacks, dubbing the mysterious figure the Axeman of New Orleans. As the summer of 1918 continued, the Axeman remained at large, and fear spread throughout the city. People whispered about the killer, wondering when and where he would strike next, but no one could have predicted the horrifying events that were yet to come. As the summer of 1918 progressed, the Axeman continued his reign of terror, striking again on the night of August 5th. This time, his victim was a young woman named Anna Schneider, as she was 8 months pregnant and had been sleeping in her home when a dark figure attacked her, beating her repeatedly in the face with an unknown object. Unlike the previous victims, no axe was found at the scene. Despite her severe injuries, Schneider survived the attack, and just a week later, she gave birth to a healthy child. The brutality of the assault only added to the growing fear in New Orleans. The police struggled to find any leads, and with each attack, the killer seemed to vanish without a trace. Then just a few days later, another attack occurred. On August 10th, an elderly man named Joseph Romano was found by his nieces, who had been awakened by the sound of a struggle. Romano had been struck in the head with an axe, and although he was still alive when discovered, he died shortly after receiving medical attention. His nieces claimed to have seen the attacker fleeing the scene, describing him as a tall man, dressed in dark clothing and wearing a slouched hat. Despite this description, the police were no closer to identifying a suspect. The pattern of attacks began to emerge more clearly. In almost every case, the Axeman targeted homes that were easily accessible, often by removing a panel from a back door. The victims were struck in the head, and the weapon, usually an axe, was left behind. Strangely, nothing was ever stolen from the homes, ruling out robbery as a motive. With fear gripping the city, some residents took matters into their own hands. Many armed themselves with weapons, while others stayed up through the night, determined not to be caught off guard. People speculated wildly about who the Axeman could be, with theories ranging from a crazed madman to someone seeking revenge. Italian immigrants were particularly on edge, as many of the victims had been of Italian descent, leading to concerns that the attacks were racially motivated. The police force faced immense pressure to capture the killer, but they were overwhelmed with dead-end leads and baseless accusations. Some arrests were made, but each time the suspect was released due to a lack of evidence. The Axeman's ability to disappear after each attack only added to the public's frustration. Just when it seemed that the city might have a chance to recover from the horror, the Axeman struck again, proving that he was far from finished. His next attack would send New Orleans into a full-blown panic, cementing his place in history as one of the most terrifying serial killers of the era. Months passed without another attack, and the people of New Orleans began to hope that the nightmare was over. However, on the night of March 9th, 1919, the Axeman reappeared, claiming another victim. This time, he targeted a man named Charles Cordemelia, his wife Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary. The family lived in the town of Gretna, just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. The attack was brutal. The killer forced his way into the home, striking each family member with an axe. Mary, the young child, did not survive. Rosie and Charles were severely injured, but managed to recover in the weeks that followed. Rosie later accused a man named Orlando Giordano and his son Frank of committing the attack. Both were arrested and convicted, despite weak evidence. Frank was sentenced to death, while his father received a life sentence. However, a year later, Rosie recanted her testimony, admitting that she had made a false accusation out of fear and grief. The Giordanos were released, but the damage had already been done. The attack on the Cordemelia family sent New Orleans into a renewed state of panic. People feared that the Axeman would continue striking at random, and many began locking their doors and windows each night. The police still had no clear suspect, and the brutality of the crimes made it difficult to establish a motive. Then, just days later, on March 13th, a letter was published in local newspapers that would become one of the most infamous aspects of the case. The letter was supposedly written by the Axeman himself and was addressed to the esteemed mortal of New Orleans. In it, the writer claimed to be a spirit from hell, stating that he could not be caught because he was not human. He went on to say that he would strike again on the night of March 19th, but would spare any home where jazz music was playing. The city reacted in a way that no one could have predicted. On the night mentioned in the letter, jazz filled the streets of New Orleans, dance halls were packed, and families played records in their homes, determined to avoid becoming the Axeman's next victims. That night, no murders were reported, leading many to wonder whether the letter had truly come from the killer or if it had been written by someone else as a cruel joke. Despite the temporary relief, the letter only deepened the mystery. If the Axeman had written it, why would he give the city a way to avoid being attacked? And if it had been a hoax, why did he choose not to kill that night? These questions only added to the legend surrounding the case, ensuring that the fear of the Axeman would continue to haunt the city. New Orleans had survived one terrifying night, but the Axeman had not been stopped. The question remained, when would he strike again? Months after the night of jazz music that had spared the city from another attack, fear of the Axeman had not faded. People remained on edge, unsure if the killer had truly disappeared or if he was simply waiting for the right moment to strike again. That moment came on August 10th, 1919, when another brutal attack shattered the uneasy silence. Steve Boca, a grocer living in New Orleans, became the Axeman's next known victim. Late at night, he was asleep in his home when an intruder forced his way inside. Boca was struck repeatedly in the head with an axe, but, despite his serious injuries, managed to stumble out of his house and seek help from a neighbor. He collapsed before he could describe his attacker. When police arrived, they found his home in a familiar state. There were no signs of robbery, and an axe had been left behind. Boca survived his injuries, but, like others before him, he had no memory of the attack. Less than a month later, another assault took place under eerily similar circumstances. On September 3rd, 1919, Sarah Lauman, 19-year-old young woman, was found unconscious in her home with severe head injuries. She had been struck repeatedly with an axe, and several of her teeth had been knocked out. A neighbor discovered her after she failed to answer her door. Just like previous cases, there were no clear signs of forced entry, though a window had been left open. No valuables were taken. Like Steve Boca, Sarah Lauman survived the attack, but was unable to recall any details about her assailant. This added to the growing frustration of both the police and the public. There were no eyewitnesses, no reliable descriptions, no apparent motive beyond pure violence. It was as if the Axeman could move undetected, striking his victims at will and disappearing without a trace. The randomness of the attacks deepened the sense of paranoia in New Orleans. Many people believed that the killer must have been watching his victims, waiting for the perfect moment to enter their homes. Others suspected that the Axeman had inside knowledge of the city's neighborhoods and was carefully selecting his targets. Some thought the crimes were connected to organized crime, while others feared that the Axeman was a madman with no clear motive at all. Despite widespread fear, the police still had no concrete leads. Investigators continued to search for connections between the victims, but beyond the method of entry and the choice of weapon, there were few patterns. Each attack had its own variations, making it difficult to establish a clear profile of the killer. The attack on Sarah Lawman would not be the last. The Axeman still had one more victim to claim before his reign of terror would mysteriously come to an end. The final known attack attributed to the Axeman of New Orleans occurred on October 27, 1919. The victim was Mike Pepitone, a grocer who lived with his family in the city. That night, his wife was awakened by the sound of commotion in their bedroom. When she entered the room, she saw multiple figures fleeing and her husband lying in bed, covered in blood. He had been struck repeatedly with an axe. Unlike previous cases, there were conflicting reports about whether there had been one attacker or more. Some accounts suggested that multiple assailants had entered the home, though this was never confirmed. Mike Pepitone did not survive the assault, and his murder marked the last officially recognized killing by the Axeman. Despite renewed efforts by law enforcement, no arrests were made in connection to the crime. The method of entry, the weapon used, and the lack of robbery as a motive all fit the pattern of the previous Axeman attacks. However, after the murder of Mike Pepitone, the Axeman seemed to vanish. No more similar attacks were reported, and the city of New Orleans was left with more questions than answers. Over the years, various theories emerged about the identity of the killer. Some suspected that he had been someone with personal ties to the victims, while others believed he may have been a transient figure who left the area after the final attack. One theory linked the Axeman to a man named Joseph Momfrey, who was reportedly involved in organized crime. However, no records were found to support claims that he had been killed by Mike Pepitone's widow in an act of revenge, as some stories suggested. With no confirmed suspect and no further crimes matching the Axeman's signature, the case eventually faded into legend. The fear he had instilled in New Orleans did not disappear overnight. But as the years passed, the attacks became a part of the city's dark history. His infamous letter, in which he claimed to be an entity from another world demanding jazz music, only added to the mystery surrounding his crimes. To this day, the true identity of the Axeman of New Orleans remains unknown. Some believe he was an ordinary man who took advantage of a chaotic time to carry out his killings, while others suspect he may have had deeper psychological or criminal motivations. Whatever the truth may be, he remains one of the most infamous unsolved serial killers in American history, leaving behind a trail of terror and unanswered questions.